I'd just like to thank my partner for supporting me this entire year. I'm going to miss you. I'd like to thank the government for creating great class with us today, and of course everyone for being here. We're so glad that you get to watch our program. I'm a freshman in college, and I'm actually from California. And while I'd like to say that I've gone off and conquered Texas and been living here, and I'm studying, and I'm getting a job, and I'm doing all these things, I'm still economically dependent on my parents. I'm still a dependent child in their household. Regardless of how old I am, regardless of how hard I'm working, I'm only a freshman, I'm still dependent. And while we can argue today in this round that because we're dependent on Canada instead of other countries that we're not dependent, we're still dependent. And that's really what it comes down to today is I'm dependent on my parents for things like taking me to the hospital, taking me to the emergency room. Hopefully they know better French than I do, but really I'm still dependent. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. Today, my job is to provide 3 voters which demonstrate why the opposition should get a vote in today's round. I will be doing this and starting with our first voter, which you can tag as the values. The value debate that's really gone on today has been between our value, quality of life, and the government's value of national security. However, we see that at the end of the day, when we really think about it, what do you wake up and worry about every single day? Is it whether you can get food, whether you have a place to live, whether you have water, or is it what Congress is doing? Yes, those are concerns, what the government's doing, it's a high concern, but you wouldn't be thinking about that if you didn't have a great quality of life. And you wouldn't have a country to take care of you if you didn't have quality of life. And that's what that social contract theory is that we talked about, the consent of the people who are governed giving to their government. That's really what we're arguing. And quality of life at the end of the day is the most important value in this round. And so we feel for that reason alone, a ballot should be cast for the opposition. We'll go through 2 more voters which demonstrate this case as well. First, the second voter is the inconsistencies of the government case. They chose to use the criterion of economic sovereignty to link back to national security. However, their 3 contentions that had issues within themselves don't all relate to economic sovereignty. And we see that the prices that might go down, this is dependent on Canada, and as we talked about the jobs that are going to be created, we don't know if they're actually going to be created, how many, if they're going to be safe. There's just so many inconsistencies here. Also the environment, the fact that it will be protected because we're using pipelines, we don't know. We have no guarantee of that because we don't have the permits. The permits aren't established yet. They're in negotiations, but they're not established. So we still don't know if they're going to be safe. And the fact that we're going to be energy independent because we're going to be dependent on Canada instead of Iran is such a silly argument to present today, considering that we're still going to be dependent on a foreign nation. The third voter that we're going to talk about today is public health, which at the end of the day is the most important thing, linking back to our value of quality of life. The jobs that are going to be created, the construction, it's not going to be safe because they don't have the permits at this time. And when we defined immediately as this time instead of the 90-day extension, it was understood that we weren't going to go through with the permits. We weren't going to wait for those. Not only that, the water contamination, if the aquifers, those are just negotiations going on. That's not happening right now for the legislation going through right now. So again, we see that this would cause health issues, and the pollution that's caused by this pipeline, by implementing crude oil instead of encouraging alternative energy development, which we said that federal funding going towards that instead. All those things would promote public health, but that isn't happening if the legislation is enacted immediately today. So what we would like to pose is these 3 voters that really demonstrate why the opposition won today, because at the end of the day, quality of life is the most important thing to us, and that's measured through public health. Thank you.
So, as you can probably guess, I'd like to thank some people again. I'd like to thank my partner for being a great partner this semester. I'd like to thank the opposing team actually for being great teammates more than anything else this semester. I'd like to thank all of you all for coming, my coach especially, and the professors that have come out to see me today. So, modern dance. About 10 days from now, I'm going to be doing a pirouette. You may ask yourself, how is this charming young man on the gauntlet from his side going to pull that off? And I'll tell you quite frankly, I have no clue. But modern dance has been a uniquely enriching experience for me. It's been a stretching experience, but it's been one that's been good for me. I had that first day of panic, but I stuck with it because I said, this is what I need to do to make myself better. The Keystone Pipeline is what we, as the United States, need to do to make our country better. And I'm going to be going through 3 voting issues that explain why a government ballot, a government decision, is justified at the end of this round. The first voting issue that I want to talk about is the issue of values. I mean, as we talked about, the resolution says should. What should we do? What values are important? And we've got a classic debate here between quality of life and national security. And in response to that, as a government, essentially what we're saying is this: can you have good quality of life without security? We accept the fact that you can have security without good quality of life. That can happen. We accept that. We do not accept the fact that you could have good quality of life without security. Security is a prerequisite to good quality of life. It is more important than valuing quality of life in governmental policies, and that's the first reason why we believe a government ballot is justified, because of this fundamental value, the value of national security. Second voting issue I want to give is the issue of health. Now, you may be confused because the opposition brought this point of health, but it relates to what we're talking about under the government's second contention as well, of environmental preservation. Historically, pipelines are safer for transporting oil than any other method. Yes, the opposition brought up the Deepwater Horizon incident with BP. This was not a pipeline. This is a situation where we were drilling oil off our coast and transporting it by sea to various places. And yes, they had a disaster. If we'd had a pipeline from Canada, would this disaster have happened? We don't know. But without a pipeline, it certainly did. Pipelines are safer. Pipelines are what come through a Keystone Pipeline, come through the government side of this resolution. And that's the second reason why we believe that a government ballot is justified. Because of pipelines. Because pipelines are safer and better for human health. The third voting issue I want to talk about is the issue of history. Historically, what have we seen? We've seen that our nation is dependent on other nations for oil. That's a fact of life. We can't produce enough in the United States to fuel all of our needs. And we've also seen that bad things happen when we depend on bad people to get that oil. We saw in 1973 that when we were dependent on OPEC to get our oil, we were beholden to other nations. We compromised our national security in the interest of just getting that oil. And yes, under the government's case, we would be partially dependent on Canada for getting our oil. So I guess the question is, are Canada and Iran comparable? And the government would say they're not. Yes, Canada is another country, but Canada's a close ally. They have a history of being our ally. They are close to us, to our hearts, to our values. That's the kind of country that if we're going to be dependent on oil, we want to be more dependent on. Plus, this is a pipeline setting up energy infrastructure inside the United States, rather than being dependent on oil from overseas. Our country becomes more energy independent, and based on past history, we can see that this is an important issue. Also, we can look at our present situation. Iran doesn't like us. Iran is threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. This is a present issue where we need to get better access to oil now. We can't afford to wait. We need to act immediately. And finally, we can look at the future. The future of energy appears to be in South America, and South America is not real thrilled with us right now. This pipeline allows us to be more energy independent, away from countries like South America that don't really like us. Let's look at the historical facts. We can see that this pipeline is what's needed. This pipeline is what's better for us as a country. I have scars on my feet from dance, all right? I actually haven't been able to wear flip-flops for about the past week because I ripped about a square inch of skin off of my left foot. It hasn't been pleasant, but I still maintain that dance has been a great activity for me. This Keystone Pipeline project is not without risks. We as the government team acknowledge that, but we also maintain that it is the right project for us to take. We've looked at the values in play here, and we've seen that national security is what we should be considering above quality of life, and that justifies the government side in this round. Secondly, we looked at the issue of public health and saw that actually, if we really want to be focused on public health again talks about the government side of this resolution. And finally, we looked at history. We looked at the different historical things that have happened throughout time. We saw that these, again, say that we need the Keystone Pipeline. So in closing, I would say 2 things. First, agree with me that the United States federal government should immediately enact legislation to approve the Keystone Pipeline. And secondly, go Frogs.